Thank you to UNCTAD for inviting me to today to speak at this event. It's an interesting event for UNEP to speak at, I guess, in some ways because we're not part of the immediate family. So this is the first comment you'll have not from the immediate investment and development community. As Natalie rightly pointed out, UNEP itself does not have a mandate to work on investment treaties and investment law. However, a number of I would say the documents and what's been produced by UNCTAD is very relevant to UNEP's work, and I would just like to congratulate UNCTAD on the document. I think it's quite compelling, and the development of the investment policy framework for sustainable development. A very unfortunate acronym, but yet a really very very useful document. It's also extraordinarily timely. As you know, we just had the Rio +20 conference where one of the two themes was the transition to a green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. UNEP has been promoting this concept of green economy, and others have been promoting the concept of green growth for the last 4 years, and it culminated in this conference most recently. What's interesting about the concept and what's relevant to your work is that most of the focus, if not the heart of that initiative, is really about ultimately investment. It's how do we shape and steer investment to a series of economic sectors in which to green those sectors, or in other words, to make those sectors more sustainable. And to promote sustainable development. And so I think it's quite good timing that you've released this most recent report. Because ultimately most of the analysis that we've had so far on increasing this investment has just been a call for investments, and what UNEP has principally done is looked at models and what would an increase in investment mean for the sectors in terms of job creation, in terms of economic development. But what we haven't considered to any great extent is the governance surrounding this investment and how this investment is managed at both the national and international level. So it's a very welcome analysis. In terms of Rio, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read through the Rio outcome document, but it is interesting to see how often investment is mentioned in the document, and it's critical for most countries in terms of what they see as an important transition. And I think your comments within the report highlighting how we have basically a changing environment in terms of the investment climate coincides with this. But we saw investment mentioned in sections referring to sustainable agriculture, land management, rural development, water and sanitation, clean energy technologies, technological innovation, and sustainable tourism. It's mentioned really throughout, and maybe you were heavily involved in ensuring that it was mentioned throughout. But what's interesting is, and I think it's interesting for this community, and I could be wrong. I was just reviewing the Rio +20 outcome document again this morning. I didn't see any mentions of international investment treaties, domestic investment law, domestic investment contracts. And I thought, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong. You can look quickly on the agreement, but I don't think it is mentioned. And I think this is very interesting. If you compare it to trade, which trade governance has 2 full paragraphs within the outcome document focused on how trade will contribute to, or potentially can contribute to green economy and green growth. It is notable that investment isn't mentioned at all, or the investment governance aspect isn't mentioned at all. And I'm not sure exactly why. It would be a question to this community. But certainly, in my mind, it should be mentioned at the very least as much as trade, because the impact of investment governance on how investment flows are managed and directed is absolutely clear. Not to pick on trade, I mean, trade is also very interesting. You can reduce tariffs on environmental goods and services, and you may increase a bit of investment flow, but it's certainly not as direct as in the investment context. I'm hoping that this document and other work that UNCTAD plans to do now in this area can help stimulate that international dialogue. What do we need to do with these investment agreements to ensure that the money is directed appropriately and is directed in a way that supports governments' objectives for sustainable development? These objectives are stated crystal clear in the Rio outcome document. So there's no question that what you're producing today and what you've produced today has incredible importance globally in terms of this overall direction. I should say there's one exception. The principles of responsible agricultural investment was noted, but other than that, no other governance aspects of Rio Plus 20 were included in the Rio Plus 20 outcome document. I just have a couple of specific comments on the IPFSD. First of all, I think it's going to be very valuable and very useful. UNEP, we currently work with over 20 countries, and then we partner with the International Labor Organization in another 10 countries to promote green economy, green growth, to encourage the use of investment in specific economic sectors. I think certainly this kind of policy framework is something that we can take with us when we go on what we call advisory services to work with these countries to develop new policies and new regulations. One of the things I focused on to some degree was, I think, in the national policy section of the report, which spent a lot of time focused on indicators, reviewing how the national policies are working, and how do we then change the policies. And I think there's a challenge embedded there, and that's what Natalie was posing, which is once you have these policies, how do you change them? That being said, I think it's a very powerful mechanism. I think it's extremely important to review to see whether or not the stated goals, the objective of supporting sustainable development, are truly met once these policies are in place. For instance, in the trade context, that doesn't exist. Certainly, in the trade context, sustainable development is one of the stated objectives of the World Trade Organization, and yet there's no mechanism in which the trade organization can go back to the countries and say, hey, are our goals being met? We have trade policy reviews looking at trade law, but that doesn't exist. I think that's a failure of the trade regime, and it would be useful if the investment regime avoids that failure to the extent to the extent possible. But perhaps even more importantly than the ex post assessment is to also include an ex ante assessment. So where you talk initially about the strategies, the overall strategies for the national investment policy, it would be very interesting to include in that a recommendation for an ex ante assessment. And we have a number of different methodologies that currently exist. From the environmental context, there's strategic environmental assessments, but there are examples from other types of areas of work. The advantage, of course, of doing an assessment before you actually implement the policy or in concurrence while you're evaluating the policy is that you can change it at the time. You can look at what the potential impacts are on sustainable development, so you can look at the economic, environmental, and social impacts, and you can actually change the policy because as we all know, once policy is embedded, even with a good review, it can be very difficult to change at the end. So I would just encourage you to think about adding some ex ante assessment to the overall framework. And then, of course, within the framework, I focused a little bit on the environmental section, given my background. And I have to say I was very impressed going through the entire document until I came to that environmental section of the framework, because it really doesn't meet the same. I would say it doesn't quite meet the same goals and objectives as stated up front, which is to really have an agreement that can promote investment in environmental issues. And I would say, and I think it's easily remedied in the sense that some of the other sections encourage governments, or governments can encourage companies to do X, Y, and Z. I think this is a great opportunity for governments to encourage companies to invest in sustainability from an environmental perspective as well. The principal focus is mostly on environmental impact assessments, which is understandable. They're very important mechanisms. There's also I believe if I recall, a call to really focus and maybe even mandate that countries meet certain criteria in terms of best available technologies. I think that's also understandable. But there's also an aspect which is really focused on opportunities, not just costs. And for far too long, I should say, the environment and environmental issues have been perceived by business as being a hindrance to economic development. I think what we see out of Rio +20, and certainly what we're promoting, is that the environment also provides an opportunity. And it would be interesting to see how that might be reflected in the framework as well. And I think one of the, I guess I'll just conclude by saying one of the most exciting aspects of the framework, at least in my perception, and I'm not an expert in this area, but is that it potentially it has the potential to level the playing field to a certain degree for those companies that are interested in long-term sustainable investments, because they know that if they go into a country with this type of framework, that they won't be undercut by a company that has a short-term, simply profit-maximizing interest. And I think that in itself can be quite powerful. And I think it's a very intelligent move, and it's something that countries should seriously consider, because what we see globally is that there is a trend towards this. Some of you may be familiar with the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, but this is a series of principles that asset managers sign on to, basically indicating that they will look at issues of environmental and social governance in their investment decisions. I mean, currently there are over 1,000 of the largest investment houses are signatories to this, with approximately $30 trillion in management. This is, I mean, so now this is a trend, and this is a significant one. So I think that I would applaud you on the report, because I think to the extent that you can also sort of turn what is traditionally thought of as risks into opportunities, we will all benefit in the end. Thank you.